Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How Leaders Speak, Advanced Techniques. This is part 2 in a series featuring TERP alumnus Dr. Stephen D. Cohen. Stephen was with us on June 10th for the first part of the How Leaders Speak webinar. That was Fundamentals. I am Joyce Jones, Director of Affinity and Special Interest Networks for the Alumni Association, and I will be introducing our guest speaker shortly. Today's webinar is exclusively for Alumni Association members, so we thank you for your membership. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available for a limited time to all registrants. Communication will be distributed to everyone once the webinar recording is accessible. Today's presenter, TERP alumnus Dr. Stephen D. Cohen, is an instructor at the Harvard Division of Continuing Education and an assistant professor of communication at University of Baltimore's Klein Family School of Communications Design. He is an accomplished scholar, a dynamic speaker who has delivered more than 100 courses and workshops on public speaking and workplace communication. He has been quoted in publications such as the Financial Times and the Baltimore Sun, and was featured in the BBC Radio 4 documentary, Churchill's Secret Cabinet. Dr. Cohen is currently conducting research in 2 primary areas: the intersections between public speaking and leadership development, and the design and delivery of oral communication training programs. He is particularly interested in the use of experiential exercises and technology-based approaches to help promote communication competence. Dr. Cohen's work has appeared in College Teaching, Communication Teacher, the International Journal of Listening, Listening Education, Relevant Rhetoric, and Toastmaster Magazine. He is the author of 2 books, Public Speaking, The Path to Success, and Lessons from the Podium, Public Speaking as a Leadership Art. He is also the editor of On the Path to Success, Readings and Resources, a collection of thought-provoking articles on the art and practice of public speaking. Dr. Cohen previously served as Managing Director of the Oral Communication Program at the University of Maryland. As part of this role, he managed assessment initiatives, curriculum development, and instructor training for a large-scale general education program. He earned a PhD in communication from the University of Maryland, a Master in Public Policy from Harvard University, and a Bachelor of Arts in Business Administration, summa cum laude, from the University of Florida. He also earned an advanced Toastmaster designation from Toastmasters International. Welcome, Dr. Stephen D. Cohen.
Thank you, Joyce, and hello, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to part 2 of our series on how leaders speak. And today I want to focus on more advanced techniques that we can use to really take our speaking skills to the next level. But before we begin, let me thank the University of Maryland Alumni Association for their hospitality and support in promoting and making today's webinar happen. It's really been a pleasure working with all of you. And I also want to thank all of you on the line today, both those of you who joined our first webinar on the fundamentals and those of you who are taking some time out of your busy day to join us today to focus on more advanced techniques. Welcome, everybody, and let's get started. Today, what I want to focus on is really how to make our speech shine, how to make our speech stand out. And we want to learn techniques today, or focus on techniques that all of us can use to capture our audience members' hearts and minds. But let me also add hearts, minds, and imaginations, because when we talk about more advanced techniques that professional speakers use, it's not just about what's up in the brain and what's in the heart. It's about making people believe in our messages, making them feel what we feel, making them do what we want them to do. And so to that end, I want to focus on 3 specific topics today. First, how to structure a persuasive presentation. And this section will build on the first webinar I did some time ago with the Alumni Association, focusing again on Monroe's motivated sequence in more depth, the framework that we can use to structure an effective, persuasive presentation, whether we want to sell a product, a service, or a public policy. Next, we'll look at how to make our message memorable. What are some of the rhetorical devices and some of the techniques that we can use to really make our message stand out, make it something that the audience remembers long after our presentation has ended. And finally, we'll talk about Q&A, but not so much from the traditional sense, more a set of frameworks, a few different frameworks that we can use depending on the type of question we're asked to make sure that our response, our answer, is structured and effective. So that's what we're going to do today. And in total, our focus again is on capturing our audience members' minds and hearts to really make them connect with what they're saying and make our message resonate. Before we jump into that first topic, Joyce, I'm hoping you can help me. I'd love to get a sense of who's on the line today in terms of everyone's comfort with speaking in front of an audience. So Joyce, if you could kindly launch that first poll question.
Okay. First poll question has been launched. How comfortable are you with public speaking? Are you very comfortable? Are you very uncomfortable? Uncomfortable, somewhat comfortable, comfortable, or very comfortable? And the poll is in progress. Still in progress. Votes are still coming in. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. Oh, whoops. Didn't mean to close the poll. But so the results, 4% very uncomfortable, 10% uncomfortable, 37% somewhat comfortable, 37% comfortable, so there's a tie there, and 11% very comfortable.
Interesting, Joyce. So on the line today, we have a whole host of people who are generally pretty comfortable with speaking in public, which I think is a nice fit given that today we're focusing on more advanced techniques. I certainly wanted to get that information to make sure that I could make today's presentation as relevant as possible for all of you on the line. Well, thank you very much for participating. Let's launch now, or let's begin rather, by looking at our first topic, how to structure a persuasive presentation. Now let me start by talking a little bit about Monroe's motivated sequence. In a moment, I'm going to take you through this sequence, and then we're going to look at an example to help us understand how this sequence works in more depth. Monroe's motivated sequence is a 5-part persuasive arrangement that was pioneered by a professor of rhetoric at Purdue University named Alan Monroe. And this 5-step sequence essentially helps us focus on identifying and satisfying the audience's needs. The first step in the process is called attention. Attention focuses on grabbing the audience's attention as close to the beginning of the session as possible. Now, one of the reasons I was so upbeat with my voice, and I was focused on making sure everyone understood both the title and the focus of today's presentation, was to capture all of your interest, to grab your attention as close to the beginning of the presentation as possible so that you'll think, wow, this is really interesting, I want to pay attention. Later in today's presentation, we're going to talk about some specific strategies we could use to open a presentation. But for now, let me point out that first step, attention, is so critical. And one of the reasons is because of this notion of thin slicing. And thin slicing is a notion from social psychology that posits that audiences essentially are able to make snap judgments about us with very limited information. And they're able to do so relatively quickly. In fact, if we were meeting in person, most of you will have already had an opinion of me just by looking at me before I even began speaking. The same is true for all of you when you stand in front of a room, when you stand in front of an audience. So that's why it's so important that we try to start with power. We can't control what people think of us, but we can manage what they think of us. And one of the ways to manage their first impressions is by grabbing their attention from the start, to start strong so that they want to figure out what's next. They want to stay along for the ride. The second step in Monroe's motivated sequence, or what I'll refer to as MMS, Monroe's motivated sequence, is need. The need is the problem or the issue that the audience is facing. Another way of thinking about the need or the problem is answering the question, what's keeping you up at night? What is it that's really bothering the audience or that they're worried about or thinking about that hopefully you can address, that hopefully you can solve later in your presentation? Now notice that the second step is not the solution. Nowhere yet have we talked about our product, our service, or our policy that we're proposing. And that's because frankly the audience doesn't care. The audience only cares about what's in it for me. How will your presentation benefit me, and why should I pay attention? Why should I listen? So before we ever introduce what we're selling or what we're trying to promote, what we're trying to advocate, we need to focus on that need. We need to help them understand that we get their problem, we get their issue. And so it's so important that we talk about that need in some depth so that the audience thinks, what a tough situation. I didn't realize things were so bad. Or, wow, I'm so glad you understand what I feel. You understand the pain points that I'm feeling in my life, in my family, or in my organization. That's what that second step, the need, is truly all about. Step 3 in MMS is called satisfaction. Satisfaction is just a fancy word for solution. It's the solution to the problem or the need that we identified in step 2. And what we do in this third step, this third point in our presentation, is we talk about how our solution satisfies the problem, how it works, how it makes things better, any features of the product, of the service, or of the policy that are particularly useful or important in satisfying that need. Now, this is the first time we actually reveal our product, reveal our service, or reveal the policy position that we're trying to promote, here in step 3. We didn't identify that earlier because, frankly, we had to first capture our audience's interest, and we had to show them that we understand the need they're facing. It's not until we identify that need, that we show them that we feel their pain, that we understand what they're facing, that they'll be open to us helping satisfy that need, that they're open to saying, I'm really appreciative that you understand what I'm feeling, or gosh, that approach sounds like it could work, but will it? That's what we want them to say in step 3. We want them to see that we understand them and that we have a product, a service, or a policy that can help solve the issue that they're facing. Step 4 is called visualization. And visualization is often overlooked, but it's such a critical part of a persuasive presentation. It's where we use anecdotes, details, or examples that help the audience visualize a better future. In other words, it's where we paint a picture using perhaps an anecdote or perhaps an example of a situation, where we help the audience imagine the future, visualize a better future for themselves, their families, or their communities. It's where we use detail, really important detail, to help the audience understand that if they just buy our product, buy our service, or support our policy, their lives will be better, their futures will be brighter. That's what we're doing in visualization. And we're trying to get the audience to say, gosh, I can imagine my life, my family's life, my community's life being so much better if that solution were implemented or if that policy position came to fruition. Finally, this notion of action comes about. And action is where we tell the audience what they should do right now. What action steps should they take right now to make that solution happen? The key here is for all of us to be simple and specific. We never want an action to be too complex or too difficult to do. Likewise, we don't want to give the audience a list of actions because the audience will be so overwhelmed that audience members won't act at all. So we want to pick one simple, concrete action that the audience can do right now. So if we're advocating, for instance, this notion of taking a class to get rid of filler words. Let's say what we're trying to sell is we're trying to get students to enroll in a public speaking class. Then the action is sign up today. Go to this website to register for that class. So we want that action to be as specific as possible. This notion of Monroe's motivated sequence is that if we use this framework, these steps in this order every time, then we're going to hit that target every time with knocking the ball out of the park when it comes to our persuasive presentation. We want to start with getting the audience's attention, identifying the need or the problem that they're facing, satisfying that need with a simple solution, a specific solution, and that's where we introduce our product, our service, or our policy. Help the audience visualize how their lives, their futures will be better and brighter when they adopt or purchase what we're selling. And finally, outline a specific action, a next step that's simple that they can take to make that solution happen. That's what MMS is really all about. Now let me note that researchers have found a significant difference when it comes to remembering content. But this may not surprise you since this framework focuses on getting the audience's attention within the first few seconds and focusing on specific needs that affect or involve the audience. So MMS can really make the difference. Now let's take MMS and use it as the basis for structuring a presentation. And just in a moment here, I'll pull up an example and walk us all through it. So again, we're going to get the audience's attention from the beginning of our presentation. That's that attention step from MMS, from the framework we just looked at. We're going to describe a pressing problem. That's just another way of saying identify the need. Next, we're going to identify a potential solution. That's that satisfaction step we just talked about. After that, we're going to help the audience visualize the future. That's the visualization step. And we're going to introduce a specific action. That's the action step. Finally, we're going to end with impact or end with a bang. In the speech sense, we call that a clincher, something at the very end of the presentation. It's like a hook, a saying, a phrase, something motivating or inspiring that gets that audience up to their feet or gets them to want to sign on the dotted line. So this is the same framework we just looked at, just with an additional step at the end. And all I've done is I've rephrased or framed each of the steps of Monroe's motivated sequence a little bit differently, rather, to give us a sense of what we're supposed to do, how we ought to structure this presentation in the most effective way. Now, I thought it would be helpful to look at an example. So what I've pulled up here is a letter that we received recently from the University of Maryland School of Medicine. This is a donation appeal letter, and it was written by a patient, and you'll see her signature there at the bottom, Caitlin Mitchell. She's a lacrosse player and coach and survivor. And you can see a picture of her standing there to the right. And I want to show you how this letter is structured because it actually follows Monroe's motivated sequence. It's really interesting how the School of Medicine wrote this letter. They obviously have some really smart people working there. Now remember, we just learned that the first step in MMS is attention. So notice those first lines. My college plans were set with a scholarship to play Division I lacrosse until April 1st, 2012. I almost lost my leg and my hopes for the future that day. That's that first step. That's attention. That draws us in. We're like, wow, I want to know more about what happened. How did this writer almost lose her leg and her hopes for the future? It immediately captures our interest within the first few seconds. If it didn't, we'd toss the letter right in the trash and not keep reading. The same is true in a presentation. We have to get our audience's attention right from the start. Notice that next paragraph, the second paragraph, which focuses on that need. I was driving home when I was hit and ejected from the car, and my leg was badly mangled. When I was brought by medevac helicopter to the University of Maryland's essentially trauma center, it took hours for the trauma team to stop the bleeding to see whether they could save my leg. All my life plans changed in an instant. That's the need. That's where this young woman details the pressing problem that she's facing. That's step 2 in MMS. highlighting what the problem is, what's keeping you up at night, what's the pain, either physically or metaphorically, that you or rather your audience or their organization feels. Step 3, remember, is that satisfaction or solution. And look at the third paragraph of this letter. The care I received from the entire team, led by the Department of Orthopedics, saved my leg. And a month later, I graduated high school. Amazing. There is no one I trust more with my health than the surgeons, doctors, and nurses at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. That's the solution. The solution is the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And you'll notice the bolding there. There's no one she trusts more with her health. And so if there's no one she trusts more with her health, the implication is that when we're faced with a life-threatening situation, there's no one else that we should trust with our health either. So the doctors, the surgeons, and the nurses, they're the solution that this letter writer is positioning. She's saying the pain I was having with my leg that almost threatened my future was solved by the health professionals at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. The fourth step, remember, in MMS was visualization, painting a picture that's hopefully bright. How that solution will make the letter writers, make her family or community's life better. Notice that fourth paragraph. Thanks to the collaborative interdisciplinary care I received, I was able to progress leaps and bounds, literally, past the initial diagnosis that gave me just a 5% chance of ever walking again on my own leg. I am now running and coaching girls lacrosse. Look at that use of detail there, those images that are painted in our minds. I love the use of the words leaps and bounds. We could literally, and I notice literally there, we could literally see her jumping up and functioning on her legs again and playing lacrosse and coaching lacrosse. And this notion of running and coaching a girls' lacrosse team. We can picture her on the sidelines, perhaps picture her someone much like ourselves or someone that we know, perhaps our own daughter or another young woman in our families. That visualization is powerful, and it's that fourth step in Monroe's motivated sequence that keeps our attention and makes us feel like we want to be part of that solution. Finally is the action. And you'll see here in the second to last, or rather in this last paragraph here, in the letter, before her signature, it says, "It is so easy to make your life-changing gift. Please use the enclosed reply form, returning it in the postage-paid envelope provided. You can also make your gift online at this website. Whatever you can give is really appreciated." So that action step is clear. It's simple and it's concrete. Either let's donate by placing a donation and returning it in this envelope, or we can donate online at this website. It's not too complicated. It's very clear what she wants us to do. It's simple and specific, and it shows us how it directly supports the solution that we just introduced. That solution, again, in this letter, being the doctors, the nurses, the surgeons at University of Maryland's School of Medicine. So it's really cool here. It's really cool here how, even in a donation context, how we see Monroe's motivated sequence at work. One thing I'll notice here, remember that last step that I just introduced when structuring a presentation was this notion of ending with impact, this notion of ending with a clincher, something that empowers or emboldens our audience. Notice the PS here after her signature. I could not have accomplished this much without so many people at the University of Maryland School of Medicine looking out for me. Please support them. They are looking out for you too. And that's what we call a clincher, or as I positioned it, ending with impact. So we see here, as we go back to the slides, that letter that I just analyzed with all of you follows the same sequence on this slide. It gets our attention, it describes a pressing problem, it identifies a potential solution, it helps the audience, or in this case the reader, visualize how the future will be brighter once that solution is implemented. It introduces a specific action that we ought to take right now, and it ends with impact. It ends with a clincher that gets us to our feet metaphorically, or gets us want to rally around that cause. So whether we're selling a product, a service, or a policy, if we really want to capture our audience members' minds and hearts, we want to follow Monroe's motivated sequence. We want to follow the 5-step process that I introduced in the previous slide, which I've delineated in a bit more depth here by adding that 6th step in this slide, structuring your presentation, so we could see exactly how our presentations ought to be structured. This is a time-tested framework that works and that's written about in almost every textbook on persuasion or public speaking. This is the framework that is most talked about and used in those situations because of the framework, because it takes us from attention to action. And I hope it's something that we'll all try the next time we're trying to influence people to buy our products, our services, or our policy propositions. Let's turn now to talking about the introduction. So earlier I talked about how important it is to grab our audience's attention from the start. In a sense, the audience is taking a magnifying glass to us, and they're asking themselves, is this person worth my time? Ought I pay attention to what she or he is saying? And we want to make sure that that answer is yes. So let me introduce a few techniques that we can use to really start our presentation with power. On the most basic level, we can refer to the occasion. We can talk about why we're here. And I did that at the outset of today's presentation. After Joyce was kind enough to introduce me, I talked about how this is part 2 of How Leaders Speak, and we're focused today on capturing our audience's hearts, minds, and imaginations. So we want to refer to the occasion, the purpose that we're here, or the reason we've all come together. We can also present a statistic. Now, this one may be known to many of us who are already comfortable with public speaking. But the key here is to pick what I call one central statistic. Often what people do is they give us a whole list of statistics. And by the time they finish giving us all these statistics, we don't remember any of them. So why give a list when we can pick just one? That one statistic that really captures the central notion of what our presentation is about. That one statistic we most want people to remember. Let me give you an example. Let's say we were talking about Maryland's taxes on cigarettes, which is an issue that's been in the news over the last 10 years with rising tax rates on cigarettes. Here's one statistic I might use to start my presentation. According to Maryland's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, the rate of cigarette smoking among underage youth has fallen drastically, from 23% in 2000 to just 11% last year. Now, there are many statistics I could have used. I could have talked about the rates of adult smoking. I could have talked about I could have started with a statistic or statistics about how tax increases have changed over the past 10 years, or the past 15 years rather, how much they've gone up by, and what impact that may have had on different smoking levels. But I chose underage youth because in my mind, it's certainly one solid, one clear way of showing the power of Maryland's taxes on cigarettes. So we want to pick that one statistic that will make our point most clearly, that we think is the most powerful, the most poignant, or the most compelling that will draw our audience in. We can also start with a quotation from an expert, a quotation from a famous person that immediately captures our audience's attention and directly links to the purpose of our presentation. For instance, I could say that if I were giving a presentation, let's say on character or on ethics, I could say, President Calvin Coolidge once said, "Character is who we are and what we do when no one is watching." Tonight I want to talk about character. So we could see in that example how we could use a quotation to directly lead in to the purpose of our presentation. We could also tell an anecdote. An anecdote is a short story, no more than a minute long, that we can use to paint a picture of what we're talking about. Perhaps talk about a person, a child, someone who's been affected by our work. And if you want to know more about anecdotes, at the end of the presentation, I'll give you my website address, and there's a free article on there that I wrote, a journal article, that talks about how to construct a compelling anecdote. What are the components of an anecdote that can really make it shine? And so that's one resource that I hope you'll all look at. Finally, we can mention needs or concerns. We can talk about what needs the audience has. What are the reason we've all come together? What concerns are facing all of us? For instance, some of you today may be worrying about an upcoming presentation at work. That may be the reason we're here. But I hope that after today's webinar, you'll feel much more confident in your ability to present with power. So that's a way to mention needs or concerns and build the presentation around it. Likewise, I want all of us on the line today to master the conclusion, to end with an impact, end with a bang, leave the audience on a high note. Now, one of the reasons the conclusion is so important is because of this notion of recency bias. And recency bias is the idea that the audience tends to remember what it heard last. It's this notion in statistics where if we give an audience or we give a group of people a survey, that they're more likely to report something that happened to them most recently. It's this notion of recency bias. But we can use recency bias to our example in presentations by ending on a high note, leaving them with something strong at the end so that they have a good impression of us and a good impression of our presentation. So we already talked about one way to end our presentation, and that's to appeal to action. It's that last step in Monroe's motivated sequence. Remember, we want to be specific, be clear, and we want to ask for their support. I can't tell you how many presentations I've heard where people simply forget to ask for the business, ask for the deal, ask for the audience's endorsement. Let's make sure to always remind our audience to get on board. Ask them to support what we're advocating. We also can end with a challenge. We can inspire the audience to do bigger and bolder things. It's why at the end of every semester I tell my students, when you're at the front of the line or you're in front of the room, step up and remind your audience, but more importantly, remind yourself that you have what it takes to lead. That's the charge I end every one of my classes with, and it's a challenge for all of my students to stand up and exercise leadership when they're at the front of a room. Finally, we can return to our opening theme. We can reference the statistic, the anecdote, the quotation that we use at the beginning of our presentation. This is an advanced technique that I called closing the loop. It's where we end where we started. And really polished speakers do this. There's a magic to it. It's almost like, wow, that was so smooth. So if we started, let's say, with that statistic about underage smoking, the percentage of underage youth that smoke and how that statistic has fallen drastically. Remember I said from 23% in 2000 to just 11% last year. Here's one way that we possibly could end our presentation on that topic by returning to our opening theme. Here's one thing we could say. So help us get tobacco use among underage youth down to 0. Join our campaign today. We can see in that example how I returned to my opening theme, because at the beginning I had given the statistic about underage youth smoking, how that number's come down. So at the end, I'm talking about helping us get tobacco use among underage youth down to 0. Join our campaign today. So I hope now from this first section we have a stronger sense of how to structure our presentation and how to open our presentation with power, but also how to end our presentation with power. That's so important. Not just using Monroe's motivated sequence, not just structuring our presentation effectively, but starting strong and ending strong so that our audience will want to stay connected with what we're saying, and so they'll want to follow up with us. That they'll want to do what we want them to do, and so we can get them on board and work together to support or advance whatever cause we're advocating, or get them to buy whatever product or service that we're selling. Let's turn now to how to make our message memorable. Now, in the first part of this webinar, we focused on some more advanced structuring techniques and some tools that we could use to make our presentation shine. Now what I want to do is talk about some rhetorical tools or devices that professional speakers use to make their messages sticky. In other words, make them memorable to the audience. Now, at the most basic level, just as a review, we've talked about the importance of making the audience believe, making them believe in what we're selling, making them believe in us as speakers and as leaders. What this involves is a use of evidence. Making the audience believe us is really about sharing evidence that's believable. So we've already talked about statistics, and we've talked about how they need to be credible, and how it's important to cite the source. You'll notice that I talked about the source when I was giving that example on the tax on cigarettes. I referenced Maryland's Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, so that all of you knew where I got that information from. That's so important, not just making sure we use credible statistics, but that we cite the source in our presentation. Second, we want to use examples. And you'll notice the example I gave of that letter from that young woman, Kate Mitchell, who suffered that injury and almost lost her leg. I pulled up that letter, and that was what I used to help us learn about Monroe's motivated sequence. Examples are really powerful because they're illustrations of our message. If I had just explained MMS and not given you examples of it, not only would it be less clear to everyone on the line, but you wouldn't believe me as much because I hadn't shown you how it works in practice. So examples can really help make our audience believe. Finally, we can use testimonies, and this is something we haven't talked about yet. Testimonies, and we may know that word from a religious context, are statements or endorsements from a credible source. We might want to quote or paraphrase a policy expert, the CEO or the division head at the company where we work. Any statement or rather any credible source who can lead or rather can contribute some evidence, some credibility to our argument. So for instance, if you wanted to give an endorsement or a testimonial of a colleague, you could say something like, "She is the most talented leader I have seen in my 10 years at this company." That's a testimony. That's an endorsement. And testimonies are really powerful in the context of a presentation because they make our audience believe. They're another way to give evidence or to give credence to the arguments that we're making. Now, those may have been more familiar to you, but these next set of techniques may be less familiar to you. More advanced speakers also make an effort to make their language rhythmic, to make it musical, to make their language have some musical power to it so that it's memorable and so that it stands out. Let me first introduce a word that may be new to you, a technique, a rhetorical device called anaphora. And let me pull up an example here. On your screen, you'll see an example of an anaphora. And an anaphora is the repetition of key words or phrases at the beginning of successive clauses or sentences. It's where we repeat the first few words at the beginning of successive clauses or sentences. And up on screen, you see a famous anaphora, Winston Churchill's famous words from a speech he delivered in the House of Commons in 1940. He was focused on victory during World War II, and he was basically making the argument that we will press on, in his words, however long and hard the road may be. And so you'll see the repetition of the words, "we shall fight." "We shall fight in France," he says. "We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence." And this notion, this use of anaphora, this repetition of "we shall fight," emboldens the audience. It creates this use of emphasis, and it makes his message really memorable. It emphasizes this notion that no matter what we're facing, we will fight. We will continue to press forward. That's the power of anaphora. And this works not just in a political context, but so for those of us who are speechwriters or policy mavens in Washington, we could see this at work all the time. But those of us in business can also use this technique and the other techniques I'm about to go over to make our business messages stand out. We want to emphasize key words that will make our audience believe in what we're sharing. The opposite of anaphora is called epistrophe. And whereas anaphora focused on the words or phrases at the beginning of successive sentences or clauses, epistrophe focuses on the repetition of words or phrases at the end of successive clauses or sentences. So here you see an epistrophe comic. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the last frame there really does a great example of illustrating epistrophe. And let me read this to you. It says, "Certainly, like its counterpart, anaphora, epistrophe is a great tool for emphasizing important ideas in a speech or essay. An accomplished orator would know this." And his friend responds, to the pirate. Now I've learned about epistrophe, heard an example of epistrophe, and can even use epistrophe. And of course, the irony there is that his comment is an epistrophe, that you'll see how he ends each of those three clauses with the words epistrophe. So epistrophe is simply the repetition of key words or phrases at the end of successive clauses or sentences. So one of the most famous anaphoras is Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, where he always says, I have a dream that. He keeps repeating that notion of I have a dream. And perhaps one of the most famous notions of epistrophe is Obama's yes we can, ending successive clauses or sentences with yes we can. That's two situations where we've seen these techniques at work. Another technique is called alliteration. And alliteration is where we use similar sounding consonant sounds in the same sentence. And I just used an alliteration right there. Hear that S sound? Similar sounding consonant sounds. That's an anaphora. I'm sorry, that's a use of alliteration. That's why we like the name Krispy Kreme donuts, Krispy Kreme. Or the sports team, the Seattle Seahawks, resonates with us. It's because those repetition of those letters is really powerful. It's really musical. And so when we use alliteration in our presentations, it makes the audience believe in what we're saying. It makes them like what we're talking about. The final technique I want to talk about is antithesis. And antithesis is essentially two opposing ideas side by side, two contrasting ideas side by side. Bill Clinton once said, "There's nothing wrong with America that can't be fixed by what's right with America." That's an example of an antithesis. It's used where we take two ideas and we contrast them side by side. Likewise, look at the example on our screens. Write quickly and you will never write well. Write well and you will soon write quickly. Antithesis is a really smooth technique where we take two contrasting ideas and we basically put them next to each other. We sit them next to each other. And the idea here is that by doing so, we're able to emphasize the point we're making. It's not only a beautiful rhetorical flourish, but it's a great way to make the audience connect with what they're saying, to highlight differences between our idea and the opponent's idea, or our product and a competing organization or company's product. That's where antithesis can really come to life. So I hope that techniques that we talked about here really help all of us, from a more advanced perspective, make our message memorable. Show our audience that not only are we good speakers, but we're advanced speakers, that we're able to leverage techniques, whether it's anaphora, epistrophe, alliteration, or antithesis. They may not know those words. They may not know those techniques, but they will certainly like what we're saying. There'll be something musical and magical about what we just said. See that alliteration there? Musical and magical about what we just said. So we want to use these techniques whenever possible to make our messages stand out. Because if we use these techniques, we will make our audience listen to us, follow us, and believe in us. Let me now spend a few minutes here at our last topic, approaching the question and answer session. Now, the Q&A session is so important. Even if we start strong and we have a great body, we also need to have a powerful conclusion, a powerful ending that shows our audience that we know what we're talking about and makes them want to act. But we also want to handle question and answer with finesse. Joyce, let's pull up a quick poll question here. And actually what I want to do, Joyce, if you don't mind, is let's just pick that last poll question there that asks specifically about questions.
The last poll question that asked about questions?
Yeah, that last poll question there, if you could pull that up for us.
Okay. How comfortable are you with delivering a work presentation? Are you very uncomfortable, uncomfortable, somewhat comfortable, comfortable, or very comfortable? Poll is in progress. Half the votes are in. Still voting. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now and share it. It looks like very comfortable, 6%. I'm sorry, very uncomfortable, 6%. Uncomfortable, 10%. Somewhat comfortable, 26%. Comfortable, 39%. Very comfortable, 19%.
Interesting. Now let's turn really quickly to a follow-up poll question for a comparison.
Hold on one second. How comfortable are you with responding to questions about the presentation? Are you very uncomfortable, uncomfortable, somewhat comfortable, comfortable, or very comfortable? Poll is in progress. Okay, it looks like all the votes are in. I will close and share. Very uncomfortable, 2%. Uncomfortable, 11%. Somewhat comfortable, 23%. Comfortable, 37%. And very comfortable, 28%.
Now this is interesting because usually when I've run these questions before, we see a difference between giving the presentation and handling Q&A. But with this specific audience, we must have a lot of more comfortable speakers in general on the line because I don't seem to see, at least on initial glance, a significant difference, which is interesting. One of the things people worry about when it comes to speaking off the cuff is this notion of making sure they don't get lost in Q&A, and that the section that is the least prepared is not the section where they suffer, where their whole presentation goes to mush. It's so important that when we're handed the microphone, especially at the end of our presentation, we stay on message and that we continue to exercise leadership. So we want to be brief. When we're asked a question, we don't want to ramble on. We want to make sure we answer the question succinctly and move on. We can always share more at a later time. Also, we want to make sure we always stay on message. So even if we're asked a question that isn't directly relevant to our presentation, we either want to find a way to connect it to our presentation, or we want to put it aside for a later time. And I'll talk about that strategy in just a moment. And finally, we want to convey leadership ability. Remember, this whole series is about how leaders speak. And one of the key messages I want to share and emphasize with all of you is that it's really about exuding leadership. It's not just about the context or content of our message. It's also about making the audience feel that we're a leader with their best interests at heart, a leader who they can believe in and who they can follow. So let's talk about some quick strategies, some quick frameworks that we could use to succeed during Q&A. The first framework is called breaking up the question. Now, we tend to break up the question when we're asked complex or multifaceted questions. Complex or multifaceted questions. A question that I want to focus on is, should we build a new metro line connecting Bethesda to New Carrollton? Now, this may be a pertinent question because there's a lot of talk in the news right now about a possible metro line that would do that. It would also happen to run through the University of Maryland's campus. This is a complex or multifaceted question because it has a lot of moving parts. So to answer a question like this that we might receive during Q&A, We want to present our position up front. Yes, we should build the metro line, or no, we shouldn't build the metro line. And then we want to use an organization. We want to use a structure that keeps our answer focused. And there are many different ways that we can answer that question. We could talk about the past versus the present, what's happened in the past versus what's happening now, what's ideal versus what's real, some of the costs versus some of the benefits, and what they believe versus what we believe. So let me show you how this might work. Let's say we were asked, should we build a metro line connecting Bethesda to New Carrollton? And that came at the end of our presentation. Here's one sample response using the costs versus benefits model. Yes, I feel strongly that we should build the metro line. Although building the line will be expensive, we will provide better service to and from those stops and support the development of large tracts of land around the metro line. So you can see in that example that I presented my position up front. I said, yes, we should build the metro line. I talked about the most pressing costs, that although building the metro line will be expensive, I noted that it'll provide better service to and from those stops and will support the development of large tracts of land around the metro line. So even there, we see that the benefits outweigh the costs in that example. We want to make sure it's brief, it's succinct, it's to the point, and it keeps these frameworks in mind. Let me give another example so we could see how using, let's say, the ideal versus real logic model might work. No, it is not a good idea to support this project. I really wish that we could fund the metro line since it would provide better service to and from two important stops and support the development of large tracts of land around the metro line. But we're facing tough economic times right now, so we must keep our focus on creating jobs and helping small businesses. In that example, again, we see how I present my position up front. This time I say, no, it's not a good idea to build the metro line. Ideally, I say I really wish that we could. That's ideally, in a sense, we could fund this project. But then I contrast that with what's real or what's realistic. I say we're facing tough economic times right now, so we must keep our focus on creating jobs and helping small businesses. So when we're asked complex or multifaceted questions, we want to present our position up front, and then we want to organize our explanation using one of these logic models. Another type of question we're often asked is a broad question, one that we couldn't possibly answer within a short amount of time. So we want to use a technique called shrinking the topic. Shrinking the topic is where we respond to the original question at a high level, but then we build a bridge to the specific subtopic or the specific area we want to address. So let's say we asked an undergrad, or an undergraduate at the University of Maryland was asked, what makes the University of Maryland such a great institution? Gosh, that's such a broad question. There's so many things that he or she could answer. So in answering that question, the student may want to shrink the topic. The student may want to take what's an overly broad question and shrink it down to something much more manageable. So again, the question is, what makes the University of Maryland such a great institution? Here's one possible answer that that student might give. The University of Maryland is a fantastic institution that offers all sorts of opportunities. I get to interact with outstanding professors who are producing cutting-edge research. Even though I'm only an undergraduate student, my professors are really receptive to my interest in research. So you can see there that the student responded to the original question at a high level. They were asked, what makes the University of Maryland such a great institution? And the student answered, the University of Maryland offers all sorts of opportunities. So that first sentence was really broad. It met the question at a high level. But then it built a bridge to the specific area the student wanted to address, which in this case was the research opportunities on campus. So the student could have talked about the extracurricular opportunities, all the other fantastic students at the school, the size or the resources available on campus. But this student wanted to talk about research. So after responding to the original question at a high level, the student built a bridge, a metaphorical bridge, to one specific area. In this case, his opportunity to work with professors who are producing cutting-edge research. So when we're asked overly broad questions, we want to respond to the original question at a high level, and then we want to build a bridge to the specific area we want to address. So let me summarize now, because I want to leave a few minutes for Q&A. We talked today about lots of techniques that we can use to build a compelling presentation. The first thing we talked about was using Monroe's motivated sequence. We talked about the power of this persuasive framework that we can use to organize our presentations with power. This notion of going through 5 steps, from attention to action, that brings our audience in, keeps them along for the ride, and ends with a bang. We also talked about the notion of starting strong and ending strong, making sure that we're starting the presentation with something powerful and ending with a clincher or a hook that makes our audience believe in us and want to join our cause after we're done speaking. Next, we talked about some techniques to make our message memorable, some rhetorical devices like anaphora, epistrophe, alliteration, and antithesis, different techniques that we could use in a policy context or in a business context to make our message rhythmic and musical, to give our audience a reason to pay attention and make them believe in us and make them want to follow and understand the message that we're sharing. And finally, we talked about 2 frameworks within Q&A that we can use when we're asked some tough, multifaceted, or broad questions that allow us to stay in control and that allow us to show our audience that no matter what we're asked, we have this ability to exercise leadership. We have this ability to speak with power and to stay on message and to continue to advocate the points that we want to advocate. So I hope in today's presentation you have some new strategies, some new ideas that will help you speak with power, so that the next time you're in front of an audience, not only will your audience want to pay attention, but for the first time in a long time, they'll say, "You're ready to lead." Thank you very much, and Joyce, I'm happy to take a few questions.
Okay, great. Stephen, we do have a few questions. Jamie asks, how can you incorporate the rhythmic language techniques without overwhelming the message?
A great question, Jamie, and it also happens to be a question that I could shrink a little bit because there's a lot there to cover. So let me say that there are many ways that we can use rhythmic techniques to our advantage, but one specific way that we can use these techniques to make an impact is by emphasizing a point. So when there's a specific point we want to emphasize, let's say there's a key statistic or a key action we want our message, or rather we want our audience to take, that's where we use the rhetorical device. So if we want to emphasize, let's say, a particular feature about the product, that it's easy to set up or easy to use, that's where we can use the rhetorical device. That's where we can use an alliterative sentence, or where we can use an anaphora or an epistrophe to highlight that feature. So whenever there's something we want to emphasize, some feature, some statistic, some key idea, that's where we want to use a rhetorical device to our advantage.
Great. Another question here from David. He says that Monroe's motivated sequence seems to be highly effective for public speaking and also in communications, written communications, but he's asking if it can be applied to a regular workday in the dynamic of your workday.
Interesting question. One other context where we might see MMS at work is in emails. Let's say we're writing an email to our boss to try to convince her to do something. It might be interesting to try structuring it according to MMS. Likewise, if we're trying to ask our boss for a raise, that would be a great place to use MMS. Certainly it need not be as formal as in the examples I gave, but we certainly want to walk into our boss's office and start by getting his attention or getting her attention and going through the needs the organization faces, how giving us a raise will satisfy those needs, helping our boss visualize the impact that it will have, and then ending with an action, what next steps he can take or you can take to make that raise happen. So I think there are a lot of contexts at work where MMS can really make us shine.
Okay, we have
Great question.
We have one final question. Karen is asking, what is the connection between speaking and leadership?
Interesting question, and I appreciate that, Karen. This series has really been about how leaders speak. And the central notion I want to convey to all you on the line, and by the way, I really appreciate all of you sticking with us here at the end, is that it's not just about sharing our voice. It's not just about standing in front of a room with a microphone or in front of our peers and talking before them. It's about leading. It's about showing that they can trust us, follow us, and believe in us. Showing them that we have something of value to add. Showing them that we are strong speakers with a strong message. And that if they give us the opportunity to step up, if they give us the opportunity to lead a project or lead a group of people, that they're not going to be disappointed. That's what this series has really been about. Not so much about just using a bunch of public speaking techniques to finesse our presentations, but showing our audiences through those presentations that we have what it takes to lead. So the next time you're in front of an audience, I hope you'll use what you've learned in this two-part series today, and if you attended our webinar a couple weeks ago from that webinar as well, to make your message stand out. But more importantly, show your audience and show yourself that you're ready to be a leader. Good luck, everybody. Thanks so much for joining, and please feel free to contact me if I can ever be helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen. We greatly appreciate you spending the hour with our Alumni Association members for this exclusive event today, and we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.